What is happening, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll show you how to make a recipe finder app using Nextjs 13. You will also learn about what are server component, what is a client component, and what are different ways to render your pages in Nextjs 13. You'll also learn about how to configure routing in Nextjs 13. So without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Now, before we get into actually building the app, let's first explore what the app looks like. So this is the home page of the app. If I click on list of cuisines button, it'll take me to a page where I have listed down bunch of cuisines. This data is not hard coded. I am using an API called the mealdb. It's a free API. These are all the endpoints listed that you can use to fetch data. But basically, I'm using the mealdb API to fetch all the different types of cuisines. And once you are on this page, you can click on any one of these. So for example, I'll click on American, and then it'll take you to the next page, which will list down all the recipes under that type. So I have a bunch of recipes here, and now I can click on get recipe details, and it'll give me the details of that recipes, including the ingredient list, the video link that will show how to make this recipe. There's a bunch of other details that the API sends in the payload, but I've decided to only list these three things for now. So I'll go back to the types. Other thing that I've done here is I've added a functionality to differentiate between the server and client components. So if I press D on my keyboard, it will add borders to all the components. So any component that you see in a purple color border, it's a server component. That component was rendered on the server. I'll show you how to do that as well. Any component that is in a black border was rendered on the client side. I'll show you how to build server components, client components, and everything in between. That's pretty much it. This is how the app will look like. I've uploaded the code for this app to GitHub. I'll post a link to that repo in the description below. If you just want to follow along in the tutorial instead of coding the whole thing yourself, you can do that as well. So that was a quick intro to the project. Let's get started now. The first thing that we want to do is we want to install a fresh copy of Nextjs app. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll be using a tool called npx. You can use npm as well, but for that you'll have to install create next app on your system first and then run create next app. npx allows you to run node binaries directly on npm, like on the server, without actually having to download them on your system. So let's install next app at latest. Now if I run this command, npx will install the latest version of Next, which is version 13, but it won't enable the features that comes with Nextjs 13. You'll have to enable it manually yourself, but there is a flag that you can pass that will enable these features automatically for you. So the flag is -- experimental -app. We have to pass this flag because most of the features in Nextjs 13 are currently under beta. That's why you have to pass this experimental app to basically tell create next app to enable all the experimental features of Nextjs 13. So let's hit enter. Now it'll ask us for project name. I will give this recipe lookup. I don't need TypeScript support. I don't need ESLint. I don't need source directory. So no for that. Okay, awesome. So the project has finished installing. Let me open this up in the VS Code. Recipe lookup. Okay, awesome. Let me zoom in a little bit. Now, once you open this project in whatever editor that you use, I use VS Code, so I've opened it up in the VS Code editor. You will notice that the folder structure is a bit different than how the usual folder structure is of Nextjs apps. You'll see there is a folder called app and there is a folder called pages. Now Nextjs allows you to create page like your app under pages as well. It's backwards compatible, but if you do want to use Nextjs 13 experimental features, you'll have to create your pages under app folder, like how it is right now. And I'll show you how these features are enabled as well. So if you go to next.config.js, you will see this app directory flag is set to true. This is basically telling Nextjs to enable experimental feature and enable us to use app directory to create pages and stuff. That's pretty much it as far as the directory structure is concerned. Now let's move on to the next part and start creating pages. But before that, what we want to do is I used Tailwind CSS in the app, so we'll have to install and configure Tailwind as well. So let's do that first. Now in order to install Tailwind, I'll be using Tailwind's documentation. So I'll open terminal, I'll run this command. It'll install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. These are some of the packages that Tailwind depends on. So I'll hit enter, so it has finished installing Tailwind. The next command that I want to run is npx tailwind init -p. This will initialize Tailwind config along with bunch of other files. This command has created two files, tailwind.config.js and postcss.config.js. We'll be using Tailwind config to configure our app directory. Let me go ahead and copy paste this, and instead of pages, we can replace this by app. You can also leave pages in place in case if you want to create some routes inside pages directory and some routes inside app directory. So I'll leave that in place and I'll replace the pages here with app. Awesome. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to include all of Tailwind's directives to your CSS file. So let's go ahead and do that. If I go to app, you'll see there is a global.css, but I do not want to keep this file inside my app directory. Let's create a folder called styles and move our global CSS inside styles. Awesome. Now at the top of your global.css, you want to paste Tailwind base components. Now if you're wondering where I am getting all this information from, I'm simply following Tailwind CSS documentation. Let me quickly show you, and I will be posting links to all the documentation in the description below as well. So we did everything in order. So we first installed our create next app, then we installed Tailwind, then we configured tailwind.config.js, then we added global.css, then we added Tailwind directives to global.css. Now it should work as expected, so let's go ahead and test it. First, what we want to do is in the layout.jsx, we are importing globals.css, but we moved this file to styles folder. So let's change that out. Now I'll explain what this layout, head, page, all these files mean, but for now we are just configuring the project, and I promise at the end of this project you'll know every single thing about Nextjs 13. So let's just run the project using npm run dev. After running npm run dev, if you navigate to localhost port 3000, you will see Nextjs 13 homepage. Now if your port might be different as well, if you're running to next apps, Nextjs will automatically configure your app to a different port. So just look in the logs in your terminal. So for me it was saying ready at port 3000, that's why I navigated to port 3000. Okay, awesome. Now let's just quickly test if our Tailwind is working. So I'll go to app page, let me find paragraph tag and add this class. Yeah, so our Tailwind is working. As you can see, I added the class to change the text color to red 900. It has indeed changed the color of the paragraph. So now we can finally move on to the actual stuff, which is creating the recipe finder. Configuration usually takes sometimes longer, but once you're used to it, it'll be much quicker and faster. Okay, so let's move on to now creating the project itself. Now before starting the project, one thing I've done is I've removed all the code from page.js. So as you can see, it is just returning the empty React fragments, and I have also deleted the CSS files. The global CSS is there, but it only includes Tailwind derivatives. The reason for doing that is I want to show you how to configure the Nextjs app and all the feature that it comes with from scratch. So I've deleted all the code that came with the installation. Now the first thing that we want to talk about is routing. How to configure routing in Nextjs 13. If you have used the previous version of Nextjs, you used to configure routing inside pages directory. So let's say if you want to create your home page or your index page, you will simply create a file inside pages called index.js, and this will become your main file, your home page or your index page. So if you let's say if you have localhost 3000, you will basically be seeing whatever you are returning or rendering in this file. But now in Nextjs 13, the routing is a lot different. So if I go to app directory, you will see 3 files here. You will see page.jsx, layout.jsx, and head.jsx. So Nextjs 13 comes with 7 conventional file names that you can use to build your pages or your server components. One of those file names is called page.jsx. Now page.jsx is basically what your page or what your component will render, right? So let's say if I put this is a page inside this and hit enter, you will see we are getting an error. So Nextjs is basically saying that it found 2 home pages inside pages index.js and inside app page.jsx. So let's get rid of index.js inside pages. Now if I just refresh, as you can see, this is a page. This is what is getting rendered, and this, if you see the URL, this is rendering the index page. So whatever is at the root of the app folder, whatever page.jsx file is at the root of app folder will be your index or home page. And you might be interested in knowing what layout.jsx is for. Now you can think of layout.jsx as a wrapper around your components, whatever you render on the page. Now layout.jsx can be used to render the components that will be used on every page. So basically think of navigation or header component. So you can put your header component inside layout.jsx, and all the pages and sub pages that you will create will automatically get that header. This is a great feature because you can do things like fetch data inside layout.jsx and it will be readily available among all the pages without the pages getting re-rendered. And then you have head.jsx. Now head, as you can see, it has title, it has meta tags, it has links. So you can put stuff like title, meta tags. If you want to download external fonts like Google Fonts, you can put those scripts here. Any script that you would usually put in the head tag of your web page can go inside head.jsx. These are the 3 files that we talked about, but there are more 4 files that Nextjs comes with. Let's navigate to Nextjs documentation. If you go to API reference and if you go to file convention, you'll see we have layout, page, loading, error, head, not found. The template is currently under works, so that is not clickable, but we have discussed layout, page, and head. There is a file called loading as well. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is pretty important, is every component is a server component by default. And this is where loading.jsx comes in handy. So for example, this component is a server component. I'll explain how to make server components. So let's assume this component is a server component. So Nextjs will take some time to load this component from the server. It has to fetch the component from the server. So meanwhile it is fetching, it can show whatever you are rendering inside this file. So let's say if you are loading something and it is taking time, you can have your loading screen here. Now what Nextjs will do is, as soon as you load your app, Nextjs will go to the server to get this component. And let's say if your server takes a while to return this component, Nextjs will show whatever you're returning from loading.jsx. This is pretty handy because now your loading state is also taken care of by Nextjs. The second file that we want to talk about is called error. So let's create that file as well. So now what is this file for? So let's say you are fetching this server component from the server, but an error occurred on the server side. Then in that scenario, Nextjs will fall back to this error.jsx and render whatever you are returning from error.jsx. There's another file called not found, and I would guess you'll assume what that means. If the component is not found, then it'll simply fall back to not found. We'll discuss all of these files in more detail soon. Now let's go ahead and create our first server component. Okay, so the first component that we want to build is a header component that will be visible on all pages. So at the root level, let's create a folder called components. Inside that, let's create a header.jsx. Now, one thing to keep in mind is by default, all the components in Nextjs 13 are server components, unless you mention specifically that you want certain component to be a client component. I will show you how to make server and client components both. So let's begin by initializing our header component, and let's go to our app layout. Here we'll import our header component. Okay, and then we'll just render it here. Okay, as you can see, we see now our header component being rendered on the screen. Now let's go ahead and add some real styling to the header component. The first thing that we want to do is give it some spacing. So I'll add a class name of this, will add some padding to it, background to 300. Then inside that we want to add a logo or a link to homepage basically. So div. Now for the links, we'll have to use a component that is given to us by Nextjs. It's called a link component. So let's import that link from next link. Now inside link, we'll add h1 and give it a name foodie, and let's add href attribute that will go back to the home page. Okay, so we have foodie. Let's style the logo a bit more. So give it a class name of text blue / text blue 700. Awesome. We want the font to be bold, so font bold. Let's increase the font size a little bit. Awesome. Okay, so we have centered the text as well. Now that is our header. Now one more thing that we want to add is we want to add a link to the header, but that will come down the line. Now let's go ahead and create our home page and add the link to it. That'll give us all the recipe types. So if I go to app and I go to pages, now here I'll add a div container, give it a class name of h-screen. These are all Tailwind classes. This is basically saying we want the height of this div to be same as the height of the screen. Give it a class name of homepage, and that inside that we'll add another div. Let's give it some width of about 25%, position absolute, top 50%, and left is also 50%. Okay, awesome. Then inside that, let's add our h1 and add our text explore food from around the world. Okay, great. As you can see, our text is a bit off to the right, so let's bring that to the center using transform. Okay, awesome. Let's also give it a class of text center to center all the text. Great. Now our text is in the center. Awesome. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add a link that will navigate the user to a different page. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll import link from next, and let's give it href of /types. Now inside this link, let's add list of cuisines, and let's move this link inside this div as well. Great. Now it's hard to differentiate between the link and the text, so let's add some styling to the link. Add some shadow, background gray. We want the button to be rounded, text a little big. Let's add some spacing, cursor to pointer, and basically on hover we want to change the color. So Tailwind allows you to do that. So we'll do hover bg blue -500. Great. Awesome. Let's also change the text color on hover. So on hover we'll do text -white. Let's add some. Awesome. Now let's add some spacing between the text and the button. So I'll do my-8. Awesome. Increase the font size a little bit of our header. Awesome. So this looks great. Now next thing that we want to do is we want to create a types page. So currently, like if I click on list of cuisines, it'll take you, but it's 404 because we have not created that page. Now this is the next important part of Nextjs 13, how to create subroutes. Now in order to create a subroute, what you have to do is under app directory, let's create a folder called types, and under types, let's again create a file called page.jsx. Now every subfolder will also have a file called page.jsx, and then this page.jsx is basically whatever your domain is. So your domain / types, this URL will point to this page.jsx, and in Nextjs terms, this types is called a segment. Let's go to the documentation one more time, and I highly recommend you guys, when you start building your Nextjs apps, open the documentation, go through the documentation. It has a lot of great resources that you can use. So let's go to the fundamental. Now as you can see, you have your domain, and the dashboard is the segment, and the settings is basically another segment. So any subpath is basically your segment. So we have a segment called types here that has page.jsx. Page.jsx is basically what will get rendered on that page. Now let's create our types page. First, let's go to the app that we have already rendered and see what the types page looks like. So if I click on list of cuisines, as you can see, we basically list all the cuisine types that are there. So let's go ahead and build this page. Okay, I have my page here. The first thing that we want to do is we want to build a function that will go ahead and fetch our data. So let's give this guy a name, fetch recipe areas. This will be a async function. Let's add await, and then inside fetch we will simply add the URL to that API. Now this is what the URL of the API looks like. All these URLs are listed on the MealDB API. You can use MealDB as your reference. Now the next thing that we want to do is create a const called response, add await there as well, and just return the JSON from the response that we got earlier. Awesome. Now let's first console log the response to see what we are getting from the API. Now let's call that function inside our component. Now as you can see, I'm using await here, so that means I'll have to convert my function or React component to an asynchronous function. Great. So this is all the data that we are getting. We have the meals array that contains all the areas. Now one thing to keep in mind is you can use this pattern only for server components. You can export your like your function as a async function only for server components. If you do the same thing in client components, you will get an error and you won't be able to work with that. So this pattern is only for server components. Now we got our data. So what we want to do is we want to do response.meals.map, and this will give us the area, and then we simply want to just do area.str area. Awesome. So this is giving us an array. Great. Now let's just simply return that. Now we have list of areas. Now let's render those areas on the screen. So what we'll do is we'll do areas.map and then return Nextjs link component. And for the href, we'll simply do /types/area. And we want to add a key as well because React will need that to track the changes. Okay, awesome. Now as you can see, we have listed all the areas as well. They don't look pretty, so let's add some styling to our component. Give it a class name of shadow gray 500 to add some shadow. Background will be gray as well, 300. Okay, and then we want the text to be a little bigger to Excel. Great. And then we want to add some spacing. Let's add the font to be bold. Great. And on hover, we want to basically have the same effect, we want to change the background color and the text color. So on hover, we'll do background blue 500 and text dash white. Great, let's test that. Awesome. So we want to break these down. Currently everything is in one line, so let's break those down and add some styling for that. So in the parent div, what we want to do is we want to add a grid styling. So we'll do grid. This will basically set display as grid. Then what I want to do is grid columns 1. So this will have everything in one column. Let's add some gap 5. Awesome. Let's add some padding to the parent wrapper. Great. Let's add a class of text center on the link to center all the texts. Now what we want to do is we want to add some responsiveness to it. So on bigger screen we want to show like 4 or 3 tiles in one row. So let's do that. Before that, let's add another class called rounded. Great. So on smaller screen we want the grid columns to be 2. On medium we want the grid columns to be 3, and on large grid columns to be 4. Awesome. Let's test that. So now we have all our recipe areas. So let's start from the bottom. Let's go to the home page. As you can see, we have our home page. Click on list of cuisines, we land on this page. Awesome. So the next page that we want to create is actual recipes page. Let me show you what that page looks like. This is the app that I have deployed on Netlify. If I click on any one of these tiles, it will take me to the recipes page. So this is the page that we'll be building next. Before I build that page, as I mentioned earlier, every component in React.js 13 is a server component by default. So this tile component, this container component, or the header component, they are server components by default. But let me show you how you can convert a server component to a client component in Nextjs 13. So I'll be converting this header component to a client component. So let's see how we can do that. So let's go to this header component, and in this header component we want to include a directive called use client, and this is pretty much it. Now Nextjs will treat this component and load this component on the client side instead of server side. One thing to keep in mind is in client components you can use all your React hooks like use state, use effect, and all the other hooks as well. But inside server components, because those components are rendered on the server, you don't have access to all that functionality. So Nextjs recommends that you use server components wherever you have to render some kind of data, but for all the components that require interactivity should be rendered on the client as client components. If you want to read more about where you should be using server components and where you should be using client components, you can go ahead and check out this documentation. It is pretty great and in telling you where to use which component type. So as you can see, this table, for fetching data you should use server component, it's optional to use client component for that. Access to backend resources, server components, and for the client components, as you can see, for any interactivity you should use client component. So now you know how to make client components. Let's move on to creating our recipes page. So our recipes page will basically be /types/ whatever the area is. Now we don't know what this value will be, so we don't know what the URL will be, right? It can be American, British, Chinese, Dutch, whatever. So now we'll have to create a dynamic segment. Dynamic segment is basically a dynamic URL. We don't know what will be in the URL. So let's see how we can create dynamic segments in Nextjs 13. So under page, as you can see, this is appended. This recipes page will be appended under types. So inside types folder, we will create a folder called type and wrap that with square brackets. This is basically telling Nextjs that this is a dynamic segment. We don't know what the URL or the value of the URL will be, so we'll just leave it. So Nextjs will know that this is a dynamic segment and it will treat it accordingly. So inside this type folder with square brackets, we'll create another file called page.jsx. And as you can see, the structure of every page or component stays pretty much the same. You have page.jsx, you have your loading.jsx, layout.jsx, and etc. And for example, let's say these types is taking a while to load, right? You can create a file called loading.jsx and return loading from it. Now in order to demonstrate that this loading will actually show you loading types, let's go ahead in this page and add like a fake delay to it. So let's add a fake delay to it. We'll just do await new promise, pass it a function, resolve, set timeout. Great. Now let me go ahead and refresh this page. We have added a 5-second, 500. We want to add a 5-second delay. You can see we are like loading recipes. So imagine this is a delay in the server returning this server component. So you will basically render whatever is in the loading.jsx. Refresh. Now let me refresh this page. Now that you know how loading.jsx is and what it is used for, let's also discuss a layout.jsx in a bit more detail before moving on to the dynamic segments. So you have one layout.jsx at the root level, which will be shared on all the other pages. On any segment, on any dynamic segment, this layout will be there. That's why you see this header. But let's say you want a specific subheader, this segment for like types segment. So you can create another layout.jsx for this segment. Great. Children, and let's return these. Great. Let's add a subheader, list of types. Awesome. As you can see, the subheader is there. Now any segment that is inside types will have this subheader as well. Now this is how you can use loading and layout files. Let's just get rid of this because we don't need the subheader. That was just to give you an example and also comment out the delay that we added. Refresh the page. Cool. Awesome. I hope that clears how the layout.jsx and loading.jsx work. Let's build a dynamic segment. In order to build dynamic segment, you'll basically have to create a folder and wrap that folder name in square brackets to tell Nextjs that this is a dynamic component. So let's go to that page. Cool. So refresh. American. My bad. So we are getting 404 because I named it with capital P. Let's change that to small p. Cool. So we are seeing page here. Now we need access to the dynamic segment in the URL or this value. So Nextjs passes a prop to the component called params. Let's just console log this param first. Now I want you to guess where this params will be logged. Will it be logged in the browser or here in the terminal or on the server side? I'll give you some time to think about this. Let's hit save and see where it logs. Now if you guessed terminal, you're right, because this is a server component. Remember, every component by default is a server component. Because this is server component, it will be rendered on the server side. That's why we see the console log here. So we want to do is params.type. Cool. So now we have access to the value. Pass this value to the API endpoint to fetch those recipes. Awesome. So let us create a function called get recipes. Now this will be a async function as well. Inside this async function we'll have the same structure. So await, then fetch. Let's pass the URL endpoint. This is the URL that I'll be using. You don't have to type the whole thing. You can simply copy paste it from the meal db API. Pass it a param of type, and we want to simply first let's convert the response to JSON. So do await res.json and then return this response. Awesome. Now we want to convert this component into a async function as well. Great. Now let's call that get recipes function. Await get recipes params dot type. Great. Now let's console log recipes. Okay, awesome. As you can see in the terminal, we are getting all the list of the recipes that we want to render on the screen. Cool. So let's build a recipe list component now. Recipe list component will be responsible for rendering all our recipes that we get from the server or from the MealDB API. So inside components, let's create a new file called recipe list.jsx. Awesome. Now inside recipe list, we basically want to have the grid functionality as well. So I'll go to types, page, and simply just copy this, come back to recipe list. Oh wait, not like this. Let's pass a class name. Awesome. And we are passing it to params, recipes and peas and type. Cool. Now let's import that recipe list component. Okay, awesome. Render that recipes list, pass it the props recipes, and the type is params.type. Awesome. Cool. Now that we have access to our recipes, let's just render the recipes on the screen. So we want to loop through all the recipes. I keep on spelling recipe as recipes. Okay. So we want to return a tile. Let's first add a key to this so React will stop complaining. And then inside this, let's add some classes to make those tiles look good. Rounded background slate to 300. Great. So now we are getting some kind of error, and this is a good use case. So you see how Nextjs automatically rendered whatever is in error.jsx. So let's see what the error is that we are getting. Recipes.map is not a function. So let's go back to our page. So this is correct. Let's go to recipe list. Let's console log recipes and see what we are getting here. Okay. So we are getting the data. Oh, I see. So we have to use meals instead. So what we want to do is recipes. In our dynamic segment, what we want to do is recipe.meals. Let's just refresh the page now. As you can see, we are not getting any error no more. Awesome. So now inside this div container in the recipe list component, close all these files. So first we want to add like an image component. Now image component also comes from Nextjs. Now this image component will take care of a bunch of things like lazy loading, will make sure the images are only loaded when it's needed, will save you some bandwidth. Make sure to use this image component whenever you're working with Nextjs. Let's pass it the source. So recipe.str meal. I'm getting this value from here. So this is basically the URL of the image. So Nextjs image component requires you to pass two more attributes, width and height. So I'll give it 500 and height 500 as well. And let's see what are we missing now. Oh, we are missing alt prop. Just give it recipe image. So we are getting another error. Let's see what is the error that we are getting. Invalid source prop host name. Oh yes, so we do have to enable the source host name of the image in next.config.js. So let's go ahead and first do that. Go to next.config.js, and here you'll have to create another property called images, and inside images add another property called remote patterns, and in that array add an object and simply pass all these values. This is basically saying we want this protocol to be allowed and this host name with this path. Okay, let's refresh. Great. As you can see, our recipes are loading now, which is awesome. One more class we want to add here is overflow hidden. This will make the images rounded and nice. Great. Now let's navigate to list of cuisines again. Click on any of the other types. So Indian. Cool. So our recipes are loading now. Let's move on to creating recipe details page. Let's add a link to take the user to the individual recipe details page now. So below the image, I'll add another div. Inside that div, I'll add h2. That h2 will basically contains the recipe name. So recipe.str meal. Great. Let's give this div some padding. Okay, awesome. Style this h2 a little bit. Text -2 Excel, and we want the font to be bold. Great. Now below this h2, let's add a link component that will take the user to the individual recipe details link. Now get recipe details, and for the href we will basically take the user to -types -type and the recipe ID, which is recipe.id meal. Great, let's just hover on it. Okay, yeah, as you can see in the bottom left corner in the browser, we are getting the URL, but let's style these buttons a little bit. So let's add some classes to the link component. Text to white, great. Background blue 500, rounded. Add some padding, great. Let's add some margin as well. Change the display type to block, awesome. I don't like this gray color, so let's change the gray color to be a bit lighter shade. 300, perfect. Now one more thing we want to do is on hover, we want the background blue to be 600, and let's also add text center. Cool. Now let's click on this page and see. Now we don't have this segment for now, so let's go ahead and create another dynamic segment. This dynamic segment will go under type, so whatever the recipe type is. So inside type we will create a new folder called ID with square brackets because it is a dynamic segment, and inside that we will create a file called page.jsx. Okay, so we have the page now. As usual, we'll get the params. Let's console log the params. There you go. So now we are getting the type and the ID, which is awesome. Now before we work on this recipe details page, what we want to do is we want to add a link to navigate back to the pages that we came from. So for example, let's say we list the cuisines. If I click on American, it'll give me all the American recipes, but there's no way for me to go back to that page, to the previous page. So let's add a link in the header to do that first. Now let's navigate to header component to add the links to go back to the previous pages. So I'll go to the components, open header components. Now there are two links that we want to add. So for example, let's say we are on home page, we go to list of cuisines. Now we don't need to show any link here because the user can simply just click on the foodie logo and go back to home page. But if we click on American, we want the first link here saying back to American recipes. We want the first link here that says back to recipe types. That will take the user back to this page. And then if I click on get recipe details, we want another link here saying back to American recipes. That will take the user back to this page. So there are two links that we want to add. Now similar to server components, we don't get the params object in the client component, so we don't have access to, we don't get the values of these in the prop, but there is a client side hook given to us by Nextjs. It's called use path name from next/navigation. Let's call this hook and see what it returns. Use path name. Great. Now let's see what that hook returns. So we are currently on home page. Oh, let's add a console. We are currently on home page, and as you can see, it's just a 1/. That means we are on home page. There is no segment right now. But let's go to list of cuisines. There you go. Now we get the types page as well. /types. Now if I go to American, we are getting -types -American. If I go to recipe details, we get the whole URL. Now we need to split the URL with /, so we can get the specific part of the sub URL or segment that we want. So let me go here, American. Okay, so we will split the segment using split function from JavaScript split method and pass it a /. So let's see what values do we get. Let's go to American, and we are getting types -American. So we want the second part of it. So let's give this a name. Let's create a const called current area and do path names. So this will give us access to the current area that we are on. And now let's create another const called recipe ID and give it a path name of 3, because when we will navigate to the recipe ID page, right, this is what the value that we are getting. Awesome. So now that we have current area and recipe ID, let's add our link. So before we add a link, we want to make sure we have path name. We want to do it outside here. So we want to make sure we have path name and we have current area. Only then we will render the link. Great. And the href is now conditional. So href will be if the recipe ID is there. That means the user came from this page. So what we want to do is we want to first append dash types and then dash current area. Else, if the recipe ID is not there, then we simply just want to take the user to types. Awesome. Now here the text is conditional as well, so we'll do back to, and then if the recipe ID is there, then we'll do current area recipes. This will basically just say back to American recipes, or we'll just say recipe type. Awesome. So now we are on this URL. We'll click here, we will land on recipe types. If I click on American and I go to recipe details, it says back to American recipes. Click on that and you're on that American recipes page. Awesome. Now we want to style this button a little bit, so let's do that. Let's first add a flex class here. Items to center, justify between. Great. Add some padding to the div. Awesome. Then add some styling to the button itself. So we want the color to be 500, text to be white, padding of 4, text great, and rounded, and font to be bold. Awesome. So we have our button now that will help us navigate the user. Great. Now let's go to the code base and create the recipe details page. Now let's go ahead and start working on the individual recipe details page. Whenever someone clicks on get recipe details, they'll be navigated to that page. Awesome. So if you see, we have types, and then under types we have the recipes page, which is this square brackets and type in it, and then we have the ID, the individual recipe details page, which is this dynamic segment. So what we want to do here is we do have access to params as well, so we need the ID of the recipe. So I'll do console log ID. If I refresh the page, it should give me the ID of the page. Let me save the file first. Okay, so we are getting the ID of the page. Next, what we want to do is we want to add a function to fetch the recipe details. So let's go ahead and do that. So as usual, I'll create a function called get recipe details. It will be a async function ID. There you go. And let me copy paste the endpoint that we will be using to fetch the recipe details. This is what the endpoint looks like. You can utilize the same endpoint, or if you want to fetch more details, you can look up the MealDB API to get more details on the API. Let us simply return the JSON. Great. Now what we want to do is we first want to convert this component. This is a server-side component already, so you can use async await at component level. So I can do async here, and then for the await I can do recipe details params dot id, and let us console log the recipe details. Now as you can see in the console, we are getting the recipe details. Awesome. Now what we want to do is we want to basically get this object. So let's do that. Create another const called details meals. Great. So we have access to this object now. So let's go ahead and start rendering the details on the page. First we want to show is the recipe image itself. So let's import the image component. Source is equal to details. Let's check so this is the property for the image, recipe image. So let's do that. Add width, height, alt is recipe image. Great. Let's go ahead and save it. Okay, so it is not loading. Let me refresh the page. Let me console log the details to make sure we are getting the correct details. Okay, so this seems correct. Oh, so this is an array. Okay, so what we want to do here is with meals, we also want to get the first item of the array. Okay, awesome. So as you can see, now we are rendering the image on the screen. Next, what we want to do is let's wrap this image, because eventually we will want the image on the left and the details on the right. Great. So now we want to split the component in half, the screen in half and half. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if we go to the rendered app, as you can see, there's images on the left and the details is on the right. So we want to achieve the same layout. So let's do that. We'll add the parent div, we'll add a class called grid, and then grid dash calls dash 1 for mobile devices, and we want to have 2 column layout whenever it's bigger than mobile. Awesome. Let's also add a class to our image. We want it to be full screen like this. Awesome. Cool. This is perfect. Now let's go ahead and add rest of the details. So add another div right here. Add h1. Inside the h1 we'll add recipe name. Add span. Inside span we'll add the recipe name. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we are getting the recipe name. Let's style it a little bit. So to that div, let's add some padding. Okay, awesome. Let's just make sure that we do get, so as you can see we are getting 2 column layout on bigger screen. Great. Now let's also style this span a little bit. So we want the font to be bold and text to be 2XL. Great. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to list the ingredients. But if you pay attention to like the data, as you can see, the list of ingredients is not actually in a array or something. It is just simply the properties of the object. So we'll have to get it from the object itself. So let us figure out a way to get those ingredients in an array format. So what I want to do here is let's create a const called ingredients, and I want to get all the keys of the object. And then if you see some of the properties, they are empty, so we want to filter those out. So let's do that first. Filter. Actually, before we do that, let's first get all the ingredients, because we don't want to loop through all the properties. So let's first loop through all the keys that have ingredient keyword in it. So we'll do key greater than 0. Let's just console log ingredients to make sure we are getting all the ingredient keys. Okay, awesome. So as you can see, we are getting all the keys that have ingredient. Now what we want to do is we want to get the values of these keys. So let's go ahead and do that next. So map ingredient key to in key. Great. So now let's console log. Now as you can see, we are getting all the list of ingredients, but there are some empty strings as well. Let's try to remove those empty strings by doing filter boolean. Now using this filter method and passing it a boolean, we can remove all the falsy values from an array. So now we have a list of ingredients that we can render on the screen. Okay, cool. So below h1 I will create a div, give it a class of tags, and then add a paragraph, give it add text called ingredients list. Let's add some margin as well here. Okay, cool. So next what we want to do is we want to loop through all the ingredients. We want to return span. Let's first add key is equal to idx, and the ingredient will be ingredient. Cool. So as you can see, we are now getting list of all the ingredients on the screen. Let's add some styling to the ingredient tags. So we want class name, we want the background to be blue, 500. Cool. Let's change the text to be white. Awesome. Let's add some padding. Great. Now what we want to do is we want to add rounded as well, and inline block, because I want to change the display type. Great. Now let's add some margin right to 2, margin bottom to 2. Cool. So now we are getting our ingredients list rendered as well. Next we want to render the YouTube video link. So that is pretty straightforward. So let's do that. I'll add another div here. Let's add some margin to this as well. Here I'll add a paragraph tag, video link. Awesome. And then I want to add an anchor tag, and then that anchor tag will say how to make recipe name. Let's add href YouTube. Great. Let's add some styling to the link as well. So we'll do text dash blue dash 500. We don't need this dollar sign because this is JSX. Now we do want to open this link up in like a new tab, because this will take the user away from our app. So any link that takes the user away from your app, you usually want to open it in like a new tab. So no. Cool. So now if I click on this link, it should take me to YouTube that shows us how to make this. Okay, looks like this link is not working as expected. let me console log the details to make sure the property that I'm using to get the link is correct. And sometimes the data is just missing, like the YouTube link is not there, so we'll have to add that check as well. So this is the data. Let's find the YouTube. Yeah, as you can see, the YouTube the string, basically the property is empty, there is no YouTube URL. So in that scenario, this is a good use case. So in that scenario, we don't want to render the component, the link at all. So let's do that. If the link is there, then only render the link. Awesome, cool. Let's just quickly test it with some other recipe. Okay, here you go. We are on YouTube right now. Awesome. Now this is pretty much it as far as making the whole app work, but there are a lot more details that we need to discuss. So let's go ahead and do that. Number one is, if you are building apps using Nextjs 13, you should know how to differentiate between a server component and a client component. Now the easiest way to differentiate between a server and a client component is simply by using console logs. Now if this console gets logged in the browser, it is a client component. And if I take the same console and put it in a different component, for example here in recipe list, and go back to that page, you'll see it is getting logged in the terminal. So this is a server component. Now this is a quick and easy way to differentiate between a server and a client component. The second thing that you should know about Nextjs 13 is what are the different ways to render your pages, or what are the different rendering methods. Now to do that, let's first build our app. And I'll show you a handy little feature that comes with Nextjs that you can use to see how your app is getting rendered. So if you do npm run build, okay, so we are running into some errors, map of null. Okay, so let me go fix those errors first. So basically initially this will be null. So what we want to do is we want to add a check recipe details and recipe meals, then do this, else just return an empty object. Cool, like this. Awesome. Let's try npm run build again. Okay, awesome. Now if you see, Nextjs is basically telling us what it is rendering. So we have our home page, we have our /types page, which is basically this page, and then we have our dynamic URLs as well. And if you see this circle, it's just an empty circle, right? And if you come down here, you will see what that empty circle represents. Static, automatically rendered as static HTML. So this is initially rendered at static HTML. In case of dynamic pages, it'll just be empty HTML shell, right? So let's go ahead and start our server and see what it looks like. Now this is how you will run your app in production as well. So everything that we do from now, this point on, is how your app will look in and perform in production. So let me go to the home page. Now if we click on list of cuisines, right, you will see that while we are on this page, all these calls are being made to these dynamic URLs. So what Nextjs is basically doing is it'll render these dynamic pages on every request. So these pages are generated on every request. Now how is Nextjs fetching all these pages in advance, even though we have not navigated to those pages? Now if you see real quick, like if I click on American, it'll load so fast. Look at that. British is just so fast, right? Now this is because of, let me show you. Now this is because of this tiny little component called link. So Nextjs will basically see wherever this link component is present, right? Nextjs will prefetch the route that you're passing to href. If you want, let's disable that functionality for a bit. So we'll do prefetch is equal to, by default it is enabled, right, to true, but let's set this to false, and now we'll build our page, right? Okay, awesome. Now let's run our app in production mode, npm start. But first let me go to home page, right? Now if I do refresh, right, now let me go to list of cuisines. Now you'll notice this time we did not make any call, right? Because prefetch is set to true. So we are not prefetching any of these pages, right? So if I click on American, at that point Nextjs will generate that page. That's why you see that bit of delay there. Now if I click on British, that's why there was a delay there, right? So this is how basically Nextjs is generating pages on the fly instead of like pre-loading the pages when this prefetch is set to true. Now this is server side rendering because our pages are getting rendered on every call basically. But let's say if you want to pre-build these pages at build time, right? So there is an option to do that. So let us go to the page.jsx for our types. This is where we are rendering. Sorry, not here. Let us go to this page. So under type, dynamic type, let's go to page.jsx. Now this is where we are basically loading all our recipes, right? We want to prefetch all these pages and we want to build these complete pages at build time. Now in order to do that, we can use something called generate static params. So if we export this, if we export this function and we return all the types in advance, so Nextjs will generate these pages at build time. So let me give you an example of that, right? So what we want is we want to fetch all the recipe types in advance. So we want to fetch all these at build time. So let's do that. Now I have this function that I'm using to basically fetch all the areas. I'll just export this function. Awesome. Okay, let me go to page. Now here I'll import that function, fetch recipe areas. Great. So let's give, this is a async function because we have to make an API call inside this, and this is the naming convention has to be exactly like this because Nextjs will recognize this and will generate these pages during the build time. So what we want to do is await fetch recipe areas. Cool. Okay, so now this is going to give us all the recipe areas that are there. Cool. Now what we want to do is we want to return an array of types, all the recipe types. So what we'll do is that areas dot map area, and we want to return an object, right? And in that object we'll have type set to area. Let's put parentheses around this. Awesome. Now if I run npm run build, right, all these pages, for example this American or or Indian recipes will be built during build time. So let me give you an example of that. Npm run build. Okay, awesome. Now if you see the console again, let me increase this, zoom in a bit. Now if you see, right, it says this is the dynamic routes types / type, and it has generated all these pages at build time, right? If you come down here, what does this indicate? This indicates SSG, static site generation. So we generated all these pages during build time. Now what will happen is if user navigates to this page is already built during build time, so it'll be instantly loaded in the browser. Let me give you an example of that. Npm start, navigate to that page. Now you see, even though now in this scenario, even though our link component is the prefetch on the link component is still set to false, but if we navigate to any page, it's so instant. It is like instantly fast, and that is because we have generated these pages at build time. That's why there's no delay, right? Look at that. Now this is the power of static site generation. You can generate pages statically, so the user does not have to wait. But I highly recommend leaving the link component prefetch to true. So it is true by default, so I'll just get rid of this. I added false because I wanted to give you an example of static site generation using Nextjs 13. And so now you know all the major components, like how the routing works in Nextjs 13, how server and client components work, how static site generation work, how you can prefetch all the pages using the link component, how the image component works. This is pretty much it. I'll put this code in the GitHub repo and I'll post a link to that repo in the description below. You can check it out. If you want to play around with this project, it is hosted currently on Netlify under recipes-lookup.netlify.app. I'll post a link to that as well in the description. If you have any questions related to Nextjs 13, feel free to drop them in the description below, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you find this video useful. I'll keep posting more content on Nextjs 13 in upcoming days. So hopefully this video was helpful to you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.